The next group of active ingredients that we're going to look at happen to be our twister turners or our growth regulator type herbicides. This first plot that we're standing in happens to be Loyant or fluorpyroxafen benzyl. The first thing you'll notice in this plot is the soybean plants that are no longer here right next to me. Loyant at higher rates are very, very hard on soybeans. So anywhere from about a label rate of soybean at a pint or a label rate of Loyant of a pint per acre down to about 1/256th of a label rate, we'll see very significant injury on soybeans, basically plant death. Once we start getting below those rates, we actually see very little injury. It kind of caves off in a hurry. And so some of the injury you might see at those really low drift rates could be some J root or S curve stems. We've seen that a lot at earlier growth stages where those stems will take an S curve and then keep growing up. You can see almost a little bit of leaf strapping, or what you'll see is those leaves tend to turn themselves upside down. So instead of doing other weird growth things, they'll flip those leaves upside down and kind of look like they're trying to grow the opposite way. So those are some symptoms that we do see from Loyant on soybeans if we don't get complete plant death when we have a little bit lower of a rate. Behind me on the cotton, you'll see that the cotton is actually fairly tolerant of Loyant. There is some injury symptoms we'll look at, but on the whole, especially compared to soybeans, cotton handles especially a drift rate of Loyant quite well. And then behind that in the corn, may be difficult to see here, but there is some definitely crop injury on our corn as well, where it caused some lodging or lean to those corn plants. And if we had more of a field of that or a bigger area, we could potentially see some down corn because of the Loyant injury. So once again, we're kind of looking at a close-up of the cotton. We see much less injury on cotton as we did compared to our soybeans, but there still is some fairly significant injury here on these cotton plants. And what you'll notice up close here is this deep reddening color, and then the severe effect that it has on the petioles of the leaves here of the cotton plant. And it really somewhat acts similar to soybean in the fact that it causes those petioles to grow weird and almost flip those leaves upside down like we can see here. So that deep purple reddening color, those petioles growing in oblong directions and then kind of flipping over upside down like that is typically a sign of Loyant on cotton. The other thing I wanted to mention is that across our different varieties here of cotton, it really doesn't matter whether we have Extend Flex or Enlist cotton. None of them provide an extra tolerance to Loyant whatsoever, and the same applies to our soybean varieties. Enlist, Extend, the Liberty Link, any of those, none of them provide any kind of tolerance to Loyant. They are all treated equally as far as if Loyant were to hit one of those different varieties. They cause about the same amount of injury and the same symptomology to occur. So continuing on with our twister turner growth regulator plots, I'm standing here in our 2,4-D plot. One of the first things I wanted to recognize too that I didn't mention before with any of these growth regulating herbicides is that they typically act on our new growth. So we see injury symptoms on the upper leaves, that new growth that's just emerged. And it typically takes, 7, maybe even 10 days to start showing some of this symptomology because it needs to work its way into the plant and go to that new growth. So we're 17 days out now, so we are, definitely in the time frame to see some of this injury really well. But some of those first symptoms will typically show up at the 7 to 10 day marker after it's been hit. Here in this plot where we sprayed a low rate of 2,4-D like I mentioned, you can see again some soybeans where we have complete death, which obviously do not have resistance to the 2,4-D. But then right behind me here are the 4 rows of our Enlist soybeans that have that resistance built into 2,4-D, and they're looking healthy. There's no complications with those from this drift rate of 2,4-D. When we look back at the cotton, those front 2 rows there, you can see have the resistance gene. They are Enlist cotton. So you can see we have that built in. They're healthy and growing. Behind that, you may not be able to see it, but the next 4 rows of cotton are completely basically dead because they don't have that resistance built in, and that 2,4-D, even just a low rate of 2,4-D has wiped them out, and they're completely dead. So within here, the only crops that really are surviving between our 2,4-D and cotton happen to be the ones that have the resistance trait built in. In the background, our corn is looking plenty healthy. our application at the time may have went out a little bit after, you know, that 12-inch window when we typically want to be spraying it in corn, but we just didn't get any kind of injury symptoms or leaning like we did see on the Loyant side with the 2,4-D. Here we have a close-up of the 2,4-D injury on non-2,4-D resistant cotton. And the symptomology that we tend to see here is that leaf strapping type injury where it kind of pulls it a long way and you get those parallel veins on our cotton leaf. It'll wrinkle up the outsides, just a little bit of that leaf as well. Once again, this is from a low rate of 2,4-D that will cause this. But again, similar to dicamba on soybeans, we can see 2,4-D injury travel a long ways across an entire field of non-resistant cotton and cause this typical symptomology of the leaf strapping and kind of leaf curl edge of it across the field. Here we're zoomed in on a soybean plant that was in our 2,4-D plot that received a low rate of 2,4-D. And this is very common symptomology of what 2,4-D will do to non-resistant soybean. It's similar to the cotton that we showed just a little bit ago, where it straps those leaves and pulls them lengthwise, and then we'll get parallel veins to them running north and south on those leaves. It can also cause a little bit of that bubbling or alligator backing, but the main symptom there is that it stretches those leaves vertical and causes those parallel veins. That's typically very unique to 2,4-D injury symptomology. Our next growth regulating herbicide that we're looking at happens to be Facet or quinclorac. Right away in this plot, you can happen to see that all of our soybean has survived. There is some significant injury out here, but all of it is alive and still growing as compared to the previous plots that we've looked at. When we look back at the cotton as well, there is some injury symptoms showing up, but once again, that has all survived as opposed to some of the previous plots we've looked at, specifically the 2,4-D plot. The thing with Facet that I really like to mention, it can be difficult to distinguish from dicamba and even at times 2,4-D. The way I like to look at it as 2,4-D typically has those leaf strapping symptoms that we've looked at. Dicamba, which we'll look at in a second, tends to have cupping symptoms. So you can see, those plants start to form those bowls at the top with the leaves, they cup up. What Facet likes to do is that it's almost like a combination of the two got smashed together out in the field. And so you'll see scattered throughout the field where you get this alligator backing kind of bubbling up. You'll see a little bit of leaf strapping, and then you'll also see some cupping in the field. But with that cupping, you don't necessarily see that yellow color or kind of white tip like you do with dicamba, so it's a little bit less there. And often with Facet, it takes a much higher rate to cause that leaf cupping than it does with dicamba. Dicamba at a much lower rate can cause that leaf cupping symptomology, whereas Facet usually requires quite a bit higher rate to cause that same symptomology. On the cotton front, Facet tends to cause a little bit more cupping than what we see with 2,4-D. It also likes to cause what we call the Facet finger, where you'll get the end of that leaf to kind of turn up, almost giving you the finger. So you get that from Facet injury. As opposed to dicamba between Facet, dicamba tends to cause a little bit more red stem and a few other kind of things that we can look at in a second. But the typical symptoms with Facet on cotton, you'll get that little bit of Facet finger as well as a little bit of leaf cupping. So just to get a close-up look at the injury Facet can cause on our soybean plants, we're looking at this soybean trifoliate right here. And like I kind of mentioned, it's almost a mashup between symptoms from 2,4-D and dicamba. So on this trifoliate right here, you can see where it's kind of cupped like dicamba might do, but at the same time, it's strapped like what 2,4-D might do. So it's lengthened out those leaves. It's caused a little bit of a parallel leaf pattern to it, but yet it has that cupping symptomology. I also picked a couple leaves just from neighboring plants. So here's a different trifoliate. And that trifoliate, once again, you can see that leaf strapping kind of cause where it's getting lengthened out. It has more of an alligator back look to it, where it's got the bubbling up to it. That's fairly symptomatic of Facet drift. And then just another plot over, we have this other trifoliate which has some pretty good cupping to it. So again, to me, if you're looking at a field and you get a little bit of everything as far as symptomology, with some cupping, with some leaf strapping, with some alligator backing, and on the cupping, we tend to not see as much of the white tips or yellow color. That typically lends itself to being a drift rate of Facet. as opposed to dicamba or 2,4-D. And like I mentioned previously, typically we've seen that facet requires a much higher rate to cause some of this cupping than what dicamba would. So you may be able to distinguish some of these symptoms based on what your neighboring fields happen to be or what's closest nearby. Like I mentioned, with facet requiring a little bit of a higher rate, it would require that rice field being a little bit closer to you than, say, another dicamba soybean field type thing. Here we have a close-up of facet or quinclorac, that low use rate on cotton. Once again, we can kind of see where it's a little bit like leaf strapping, like from 2,4-D, but it's just not pulled as tight. There is a little bit of those bubbles or alligator backing like we saw with the soybeans. Not as severe, but a little bit there. But the real characteristic sign tends to be this cupping of those cotton leaves, and then we get this nice facet finger right here where we see the leaf tips forming up and basically giving us the finger looking at us right in the eye here. So that's the very common symptom that we get from facet drift onto cotton. Our final growth regulator plot that we're going to look at today is a low rate of dicamba. So in this plot we sprayed XtendiMax at a low rate. Again, the typical symptomology that we would expect out of dicamba versus some of our other growth regulators on soybeans happens to be leaf cupping. So it tends to turn those leaves and cup them a little bit, especially at low rates. And that's really the primary symptom that we see on soybean leaves. And on those cupping, it will tend to form more of a white kind of color or light yellow color at the tip and cause that tip to form in a little bit more than something like facet would. When we're looking at our soybean varieties here right next to me, you'll notice that the rate that we used of XtendiMax just absolutely killed everything that was non-Xtend soybean or non-resistant to dicamba. The two rows that are right behind me though happen to be an Xtend variety or a dicamba resistant variety, so they're completely healthy and growing and no problem whatsoever. Back behind me there, when you look at the cotton, our typical symptomology in cotton happens to be, you know, that roll on the leaf margin, some light yellow color around the leaf margin, as well as the petioles turning kind of a bright red color that you can see there. When we look back at those varieties, you'll notice several of our enlist varieties, which are up front, are damaged quite a bit because they don't have that resistance to dicamba. But the back two rows where we have the Xtend Flex cotton that's resistant to dicamba, they're healthy, growing strong, and there's no problem there from this low rate of dicamba. Here we're looking at a close-up shot of soybean that was in our low rate of dicamba plot. Like I mentioned before, a lot of these growth regulators will translocate, go to our new growth, and cause the injury to show up on new trifoliates that are trying to emerge out of the plant. So you can see all of our new growth here is showing cupped and curled tips on those leaves and showing that cupping symptomology of what a low rate of dicamba can do on a non-resistant soybean. Now this symptomology, what dicamba does to soybeans, it's very, very sensitive to a non-resistant variety is very, very sensitive to dicamba. We can see this cupping symptomology occur all the way down to 1/50,000th of a label rate. So when we're looking across the field, we can have different rates go across the field and still see very similar symptomology just because of how sensitive non-resistant soybean plants are to dicamba. Here we're looking at a close-up of the low rate of dicamba onto non-resistant cotton. And so the typical symptomology that we see on the cotton tends to be a little bit of leaf bubbling or kind of rolling on the leaf margins. So you can see it along the margins where it's happening, as well as a yellow color. So, it can be a little bit similar to facet where it kind of causes a little bit of cupping or leaf roll on the edge. But the difference is this causes a lot more yellowing, and we don't get that facet finger where that leaf tip turns up and looks at us. It really just kind of rolls the margins and then causes that yellowing color. So this, once again, is kind of a typical symptomology of dicamba onto non-resistant cotton. The other symptom that is fairly common of dicamba drift or a low rate of dicamba onto non-resistant cotton happens to be the red petioles that it'll form here on the cotton plant. And so it's not quite as red as what loyant can cause, but it is another symptom along with the leaf margin bubbling and that little bit of leaf curling and yellow color. It can cause some pretty good red color to form on those petioles.